part of their brief. Another question I want to go into briefly, I don't know how much longer I've got, about 5 minutes I guess. Can we actually develop these things? And I think the answer is, well, yes, or does it just happen? Does it just develop? Well, I think we have to realize that quite a lot of these competencies are very much at the heart of the personality, where traits and motives are involved with the personality, which are actually rather slow to change. And we have a central, the core which is more easily accessible, namely the self-concept, the attitudes and the values. That I'm getting distracted by the chat, I'm afraid. I must concentrate on my slides. The self-concept, the attitudes and values, which are actually can be developed as a result of experience, as a result of exposure, as a result of life experience. And then comes those things that probably are most susceptible to development. Those things and the much more easily reachable by trainers, by developers, namely the skills and the knowledge that are required to be more successful at the intercultural interface. This is something that we can access, we can gain access to, something that we can as trainers and developers actually manage to develop. So I think we have to be quite modest in answering this question, can intercultural interaction competence be developed? Yes, to a certain extent, but to quite a large extent it is something which does not react immediately to classroom experience, but something which is an ongoing and very individual process of development, which takes place in particular obviously in young years and during socialization, but also continues into adulthood. Is there a guiding principle for being successful across cultures? Well, of course, this is one of those stupid questions, isn't it? Of course there is. It's mindfulness. That's what what we found, what Jeremy and I found when we were looking at what competencies the successful international manager needs. There we lighted on the work of Ellen Langer, a psychologist in the United States, who quite some time ago wrote a book called Mindfulness. This was picked up by Stella Toomey, an interculturalist, intercultural communications scholar, who writes very memorably about the role of mindfulness in intercultural communication. Mindfulness means attending to one's internal assumptions, cognitions, and emotions, and simultaneously attuning to the other's assumptions, cognitions, and emotions. I think this makes it clear how important these affective characteristics are, how important also not only culture but individual preferences are. And that's something we bring out in our book as well, how important it is to regard the interlocutor not as a representative of the culture that you're dealing with, but actually as an individual. So how do you do mindfulness? How do you do intercultural business communication? Well, the first answer for us is focus with understanding on the cultural context and on the individual cultural identity of the person you're dealing with, and also, of course, their personality, but individual cultural identity. If we look at, go on and see that man called Bill Gudikunst, the late Bill Gudikunst, again, an American communication scientist, brought out the following important aspect of intercultural management communication. When we interact with strangers, we become mindful of our communication. Our focus, however, is usually on the outcome rather than the process of communication. And this is something that is particularly true in my experience of international managers. I've coached about 150 international managers in the meantime. And one thing that one notices is that they are extremely outcome-oriented, extremely goal-oriented, and they want to get there. And I think this pointing out, this point that Bill Gudikunst makes here is that is absolutely key, that we should be concentrating not only on the outcome, but on the process. The research shows, incidentally, that the successful manager is extremely goal-oriented. In contrast, the successful international manager is slightly less goal-oriented. than the domestic high performance manager. He or she has learned that the importance of concentrating on the focus, focusing on the process of communication rather than just on getting there, just getting it to the outcome. So focus without understanding on the cultural context, focus with understanding on the process of communication and cooperation as well as on the outcome. That's what we mean by mindfulness. That's the term that we use to try and get a handle on this plethora of individual competencies, which is quite difficult to handle, and which, if we have mindfulness in mind, can enable us to get the message across, in particular to international managers who tend to be in rather a hurry. Concretely, what does this mean for you, perhaps as language teachers, where this is something quite clearly in your remit, in your brief? I think we need to be concentrating on negotiating meaning. What does that mean? My goodness me, negotiating meaning, creating understanding. This is what applied linguists write about. But how do you do it? How do you actually do it in practice? Well, here is a list of functions, if you like, which the research shows can actually aid this process of creating understanding, negotiating meaning, active listening, the use of language appropriately to understand what one hears, not just and therefore to listen. Linguistic accommodation, well known to the applied linguist, in particular those looking at native non-native discourse, native non-native speaker discourse, modifying your language to make it more comprehensible, something I'm afraid I have not been doing in this presentation. The context has made me a bit of a racer, I'm afraid, but I'm now speaking to people who've got high competence in the English language. Paraphrasing, labeling language, saying what you're going to do in the language before you do it. Summarizing, testing one's own understanding, paying attention to non-verbal behavior. So some ways, some little hints of perhaps how to do mindfulness in language terms. On that point I want to finish. Perhaps, I don't know whether I'm up to time or whether I've overrun. The books that I'm plugging here, on the left, a rather more academic, theoretical approach. On the right-hand side, a very practical book written by Jeremy Comfort and myself. I see that Jeremy's actually online. He's just left us, I think. Both of these books could help you as language trainers do intercultural business communication in the classroom. Thank you very much.